Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are covering the lymphatic system. As a quick reminder, this chapter in particular is an overview. You will definitely want to take the time to look at the pathophysiology chapter within your textbook just to make sure that you've got all the key points, because it does go into a lot deeper in terms of terminology and things that I just don't cover in these videos. So just a reminder, go back and check that video out, okay? Or text that chapter out in the textbook. So we don't live in a world that is harmless. We have to deal with pathogens every day. Those pathogens come in the form of bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites. They're all over the place, and we're constantly in a barrage of potential pathogens to enter our body and our bloodstream. So we have to be very aware, and our body will help us. It is designed to specifically make sure that we keep ourselves out of trouble as much as possible. So we do have the lymphatic system, which is responsible for the production, maintenance, and distribution of lymphocytes. It returns fluid and solutes from peripheral tissues in the blood, and it helps in the distribution of hormones, nutrients, and waste products from the tissues back into general circulation. So our lymphatic system includes, it is a passive system that includes the lymph vessels, the lymph nodes, and we also mentioned the thoracic duct. And let me go ahead and grab my pointer. So if you're trying to find where that thoracic duct is, you can see how it comes up and it joins back into central circulation here at the subclavian vein. So that's where it dumps back into central circulation. So that's what they're referencing as the thoracic duct. This is a passive process with our lymph, which is the fluid, the vessels, the nodes, and we talk about the thoracic duct. Now you do have the right lymphatic duct. It is a lot smaller. It only takes a smaller portion of the body. I think I've got a picture of it here shortly, so we'll look at that. And just to kind of give you a good, clear picture of the lymphatic system, you've got those lymph vessels running throughout the same areas where you have the capillaries come through. You've got capillaries that come in contact with every cell throughout the entire body. So you also have the lymphatic system that does the exact same thing. Now there is a difference between lymphoid tissues versus lymphoid organs. An example of lymphoid tissues includes your tonsils and your appendix, whereas your lymphoid organs include your nodes, the spleen, and the thymus. And here is just a good example of our tonsils, and of course the appendix, which is nowhere near the mouth, but you get the idea here. These are some really inflamed and angry tonsils that need some help. We've got a lot of infection going on there. Then we have those lymphoid organs. Again, we're talking about the nodes, the spleen itself, and the thymus. And this picture does kind of show you not only your thymus, which sits right up here, it sits on top of the heart in the mediastinum, but you also have the spleen. And the big thing with our thymus, it is the site of T cell production and maturation. So that's the kind of part that it plays. The spleen is there to filter blood. It removes abnormal blood cells and can initiate the B cell and T cell responses to antigens as they come in contact with our body. It also deals with the stores of iron from the red blood cells. And we can live without the spleen, but the spleen, because it's kind of like the consistency of a tomato, it holds about 250 cc's of blood at any given time. So if you were in a state of shock and you were losing blood, that is 250 cc's of blood that can be pulled from and sequestered back into central circulation to kind of help get through whatever situation you're currently in. Now, we kind of look at the nodes, the lymph nodes, as part of the sanitation station. So it's part of that garbage, picking up the dump truck with the garbage in it, and that's where it kind of, all that garbage kind of gets dumped here. And the lymphatic vessels are going to provide a roadway in order to move the garbage and the debris away from the cells and get it cleaned up. And this was the picture I was mentioning earlier. If you look in the bottom corner, you'll see that the thoracic duct is responsible for the majority of the drainage back into central circulation, whereas the right lymphatic duct only deals with the right side of the head, the neck, and the upper chest on the right side and that right arm. So I'll just kind of give you a picture of how that looks. And you can see how that vasculature kind of runs along the spinal column. You can kind of see the vertebrae back there and how those lymphatic vessels kind of run along with each of the vasculature. Now, when it comes to immunity, we have two types of immunity. We have nonspecific and then specific. Now, our nonspecific immunity includes the mechanical barriers, some of our chemicals, and our white blood cells. So the mechanical barriers can include our skin, tears, saliva, mucus. Those sorts of things are part of that mechanical barrier. You have chemicals such as your histamine that gets released in the case of inflammation, and also fever. Fever falls in on that. It's nonspecific immunity. And then you have the white blood cells, which include your neutrophils, the eosinophils, the monocytes, and the NK cells. All of those are part of that nonspecific immunity. Now, our physical barriers, this includes our epithelium, so we're talking about our skin. Also, the hair, the glands, and the mucus are all there. That's the very first barrier to kind of protect us from the external environment. So if you have a case where someone has a laceration of the skin, or even more so if you have someone who suffered a severe body burn that has at least been a second degree burn or third degree burn, in those cases, those individuals, that very first barrier is completely broken down, and so these people tend to get serious infections if they have had a serious body burn, total body surface area burn, because they've lost that first barrier to kind of protect them from the external environment. And of course, I had to throw that in there just because it made me laugh. But anyway, physical barrier includes our hair. Now, our white blood cells are also part of that nonspecific immunity. So we start looking at those individual little white blood cells. So let's look at those. The first one we're going to look at is our basophils. And this is part of our inflammation. So the basophils and the mast cells, they do secrete histamine, and that histamine increases the capillary permeability and the blood flow to the area, whereas your heparin will prevent clotting, and your lysosomes will come in and kind of destroy any of the pathogens as they're coming into the system. And of course, I mentioned before fever. So our hypothalamus is the one that regulates our temperature. And so when it sees that there's a problem, your body will trigger the hypothalamus to go ahead and increase and spike a temperature with the thought process that we can burn off or destroy whatever that pathogen is through the heat as the result of the fever. So it's a non-specific defense. And then you have these phagocytes. These are your microphages. Your eosinophils and the neutrophils fall in this category, and they will target pathogens that are coated in antibodies. And they will clear, the eosinophils will target the pathogens, and then the neutrophils will clear the debris of bacteria. And I'll just let this picture kind of say it all here for you. These are your macrophages. These are your monocytes. These are your macrophages. They're very large cells. And they will just go through and pick it up and eat eat whatever pathogen comes through. So I just like this picture. It cracks me up. Again, those are your macrophages, also known as your monocytes. And then you have the NK cells. These are your natural killer cells. They perform immunological surveillance. They're looking everywhere through the body, and they are intentionally going to attack any foreign cells and infected cells. And then we're going to talk about the areas of specific immunity, which look at our lymphocytes. And you have both B cells and T cells. Now, your T cells are antibody-mediated immunity. These deal in antigens and antibodies. Your cell-mediated, or B cells, sometimes they're referred to as humoral. So I think about the humerus bone. So that's it. And I think B for bone. Humerus is a bone. So I think B for bone. This is your lymphocytes. And your antibody-mediated T cells, you know, the cytotoxic T cells, they're going to be there to go after foreign cells, viruses, bacteria. They are also the ones that are responsible for attacking transplanted tissues if they are not regulated and protected. And then the helper Ts, they're there to kind of stimulate the activities of both the T and the B cells. And then you have suppressor Ts, and those are there to do the opposite. They inhibit the T and B cells. And again, I use the humoral immunity, or the humerus, to kind of help you remember that's a bone and it's a B cell. So that's bone marrow derived immunities. So our B cells, or the bone marrow derived, they contain immunoglobulins. And we're going to take a few minutes to look at these. They are very specific in what they do. You have different classes of immunoglobulins, and they have very specific jobs. And sometimes this will come back to you when we start looking at some of the things with National Registry. So I want to take a minute and kind of go through this. You have the class called IgG. It's actually the largest class. You have IgM, IgA, IgE, and IgD. So with IgG, it's your largest class. It targets those immunoglobulins, target viruses, bacteria, and toxins. IgM is the one that's responsible for targeting those cross-type reactions. So if you give blood to a patient and it's the wrong blood type, then that's where that cross-type reaction will come into play, is the immunoglobulins associated with IgM. The IgA are the ones that attack pathogens that are found in glandular secretions. IgE is the ones that are responsible for our allergic reactions or the issues we have with those. And then IgD will actually bind antigens to activate the B cells. So it's kind of like a helper there. And I did highlight these two. Two of the big ones that you'll see with National Registry is going to be IgM and then IgE. So the IgM, because you're going to have the cross-type reactions with the blood, and then the IgE for your allergic reactions. So I would be lying to you if I told you that the lymphocytes are simple and easy to understand. Where lymphocytes come from is complicated, so I'm not even going to begin to sugarcoat this. And I'm not even sure that outside of your testing to get through this component of the course that it's going to be anything that's going to require a lot of your memorization tools beyond that. But what happens here is the red bone marrow is going to create these hemocytoblasts. You'll have stem cells that will, those lymphoid stem cells that will come off of that. Some of them are going to migrate to the thymus, and that's where they will mature, they'll differentiate, and then they get transported into central circulation. Or you'll have B cells or NK cells, and they also get dumped into the peripheral circulation. It really just depends on if you're talking about T cell or B cell mediated immunities here, but that's how those kind of differentiate out. And the lymphocytes will live anywhere from 4 to 20 years. If you're actually using the term to determine the production of lymphocytes, it's called lymphopoiesis. And all of that happens in the bone marrow. One group remains in the bone marrow. That's where you get the B cells and the NK cells. We looked at that in the picture previously. The other group will move and migrate to the thymus, and that's where it's going to generate or become mature T cells. Now, you do have these specific defenses that are innate, meaning they are present at birth, and that has to do with genetics. And then you have a section that's considered acquired, and the acquired is either considered an active or it's an exposure that you've had that's either active or passive. This gets complicated. So we've already kind of mentioned that when it comes to the specific resistance that your body has, you have that innate immunity that was genetically determined prior to birth. It's all about your genetics. You don't have to be exposed to anything. It's just there. It is what it is. Boom, we're done. So that's the simple one. Now we get into the acquired immunity. It's considered acquired because we have to be exposed to something in order for it to produce an antibody. Now there's two categories with this. You have active and then you have passive. So we'll start with the active. Active immunity produced by antibodies that develop in response to an antigen. So this is an immune response. And it just can't be that simple. They got to drop it down into two other categories. You either have the naturally acquired active immunity that develops after exposure to antigens within our environment, or you have induced active immunity that develops after the administration, and I think this is the key here, administration of an antigen in order to prevent disease. And you're thinking, okay, got it. Hold that thought. Because then we're going to come down here to passive immunity. So this is produced by a transfer of antibodies from another person. You have natural and you have induced. With natural passive immunity, this is conferred by the transfer of maternal antibodies across the placenta and across throughout the breast milk. Then you have the induced passive. It is conferred by the administration of antibodies to combat infection. So when we talk about this induced passive and induced active, they're very similar. One is dealing in the administration of an antigen to prevent disease. The other one is the administration of an antibody to combat the infection. So I think that's kind of your key point there. And this kind of sums it up a little bit more. So we talk about induced active immunity. We're looking at vaccinations. But your induced passive immunity, that's when we're kind of talking about more like our rabies vaccinations and in some cases tetanus. So with the properties of our immunity, it's very specific. It's very versatile. It holds a memory and it can be very tolerant. So the immune system, when a virus enters the body for the first time, is going to act like SpongeBob. It's going to panic and act stupid. But then when that same virus attacks again, our body has got it figured out. It's going to be a lot smarter the second time around. So we talk about immune disorders, and this is where we get into the pathophysiology and kind of hitting those highlights, kind of get you in the right mindset. Our B cells will manufacture antibodies against normal cells. This is where we start talking about, we talked about the insulin-dependent diabetics. That would be considered an autoimmune disorder. Rheumatoid arthritis also falls in that category. Psoriasis, myasthenia gravis, believe it or not, narcolepsy also falls here, along with multiple sclerosis, which we've already talked about, and lupus. Then you have the immunodeficiency diseases, where you have a failure to develop normally or it becomes blocked. In the case of HIV and AIDS, HIV actually will target the helper T cells and prevent them from doing their job. The problem with HIV is it's extremely sloppy in its replication. It doesn't always replicate the same way. And that's why it took them so long to find medications to kind of combat that or control that, because they had to find that one key item that was the same every time when it replicated, and it took them a very, very long time, many, many, many years before they were able to identify that. And then, of course, allergies. That is the bane of some people's existence, mine in particular. But your allergies are inappropriate or excessive immune responses to an antigen. I always say it's like your body suddenly thinks that the demon himself, the Satan himself, has in your body, and they've got to purge the body of the demons. So there's 4 categories. You have an immediate hypersensitivity, which is considered a type 1, cytotoxic reaction, type 2, immune complex, which is type 3, and then a delayed hypersensitivity, which is type 4. We're going to look at those. So when we talk about type 1 being an immediate hypersensitivity, we're talking about things like hay fever. You have large quantities of those immunoglobulins, remember the IgEs, that are produced upon that initial exposure. So your secondary exposures can put you into that case of anaphylaxis if you're not careful. This type 2 or cytotoxic reactions, if you were wondering if that's the result of the IgM, where you have that cross reaction of incompatible blood types, you were correct. And then your type 3 immune complex disorders, if your phagocytes are not able to rapidly remove that circulating antigen/antibody complexes, this is where you see the inflammation, the tissue damage within blood vessels, and the kidneys. And then last but definitely not least is our type 4 delayed hypersensitivity. And the best example I can give you here is the rash that you get from either poison ivy or poison oak. But it's an inflammatory response that occurs about 2 to 3 days after the exposure. And this is the completion for the lecture on the lymphatic system. Please, 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 like I said, go back and read the chapter for pathophysiology, because it's going to play really key into that material, and that will help you get through. But this gives you an overview of the main things that we'll be looking at as we move forward in the curriculum. Thank you. I hope you have a great day.